You're listening to a Countout Podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Ballot, a podcast where the conversation begins. I'm your host, Ryan MC, and today we're diving back into the world of French pro wrestling. Obviously, we dove into it last season, talking about Gilbert-le-Duc. Obviously, I got a head nod that I nailed that pronunciation. So obviously, last season, we talked about sort of the history of French catch wrestling, sort of through the lens of Gilbert. And this season, we're kind of in a way continuing that to a degree, both with the topic, but also we'll talk a little bit about a new addition to the Hall of Fame as well in terms of the history of French catch as sort of a topic point. But ultimately, there's no better guest to bring back on this topic than the same guest we had last time. I'm more than happy to talk with him again today. Phil, welcome to The Ballot. Phil Lyons returning. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for having me back.
Yes, I'm very excited to sort of, like I said, sort of continue, not necessarily continue where we left off, obviously, with Gilbert, but there is an element of continuation talking about French wrestling, sort of because of where our topic of today, our wrestler of choice today, Le Petit Prince, which we'll get to discussion. I'm sure we'll get to a discussion on pronunciation in a second. But sort of like in terms of when he starts wrestling, there is a little bit of like, okay, this is where we would continue the French catch conversation, plus the sort of trappings and pitfalls of French catch history recording as well. So I'm very excited to talk to you. Obviously, you are. I've always said I've always said it, and I think it's very much true. The preeminent historian on French catch wrestling, along with to a degree European as a whole, I would say. So I very much appreciate you coming on. There's no better guest to have on. And yeah, I guess without further ado, I'll ask the same sort of question I asked you last time. I asked every guest, what is your connection to, and you can pronounce it correctly for me, Le Petit Prince?
Yeah, well, Le Petit Prince, as best as I can do it. I'm not French. Maybe it's a little bit off, but Le Petit Prince.
It's like France, but France.
Kind of, but it's not with an I. That's the important thing. Anyway, well, my connection is, apart from being obviously, actually, not so obvious, we'll talk about it, but obviously being impressed by his in-ring ability. For me, he brings a little bit of a nostalgia when I think of him. And you might think to yourself, that's an odd thing. Why nostalgia? You weren't alive back then to watch him. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. Because 15, maybe 20 years ago or so, when I started researching French pro wrestling, he was actually one of the very first names I ever came across. And when I say came across, I mean, back then there wasn't much info anyway. And whatever info there was, obviously it was in French. And what I would come across is these kind of random articles, whether it be on the history of French catch, or maybe there's a French indie show and the local newspaper was doing like an article on that show, and there'll be like a little blurb on the glory days. And in those articles, inevitably, there were always certain names that always popped up. Always Le Ange Blanc, Le Bourreau de Bethune, Le Petit Prince. Those were always the names. So he was one of the first names I ever heard about. And then fast forward to, let's say, 2015, I think it was, which is when I first got the chance to watch some French catch footage. And I remember going to the archive and specifically looking up like a handful of names that I wanted to look up. He was one of the names. So long story short, my point is that not only was he one of the first names, French names that I ever heard about, but he was one of the first guys that I actually watched. So that's why when I think about him, and again, I'm talking 10, 15, 20 years ago almost, he brings a little bit of a nostalgia for me for that reason. So yeah, that's my connection to him.
That's actually, honestly, that's very impressive that, because he would have stopped wrestling right before 90. So I believe 89 is when his last year, for big time year, because I think he still wrestled a little bit afterwards. But for someone that's even then in an article in like 2010 or so, you get an article talking about the top stars, or maybe not necessarily the top stars, but at the very least the biggest names, of French catch wrestling of the heyday. The fact that he is a continued name that pops up, that I think
Uh,
that very much says something.
yeah, I would say, yeah, to a point, yes, but it's not so much the biggest. I would say probably the most memorable
Yeah,
names.
sure. That's a better thing.
So
Especially with Le Petit Prince. It's definitely when you got a guy named Petite, definitely not the biggest star here.
yeah.
Uh, but that's very fun. It's very interesting to get that nostalgic feeling for a wrestler, especially as a starting point of your research. And here going wrapping all the way back around to him now discussing him as a Hall of Fame candidate for the Wrestling Observer newsletter, I think is very interesting. Speaking of Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, I do want to just real quickly touch on this. And that is we got an auto induction this past season through Dave, obviously, as he is the one to auto induct, of Raul Paoli, if I'm pronouncing that, Raul Paoli, who is a longtime promoter, pre-war, 40s, 50s. Oh, I guess not really pre-war, but 40s, 50s, 60s. Sort of the promoter that brought wrestling to France. Now I'm doing it. Now France. So you wrote a beautiful article in the Wrestling Observer newsletter that I'm sure you gave to Dave and he read, and I'm sure that you and perhaps probably other were sort of pitching Raul as sort of an auto inductee person, and obviously he went in. Is there any sort of I think I don't really want to dive into the big time history, because obviously I want to direct people to go read your article there in the Wrestling Observer newsletter about Raul. But the big question I have for you is that what do you think the sort of auto induction for Raul here as the promoter? What do you think that could do to French professional wrestling where we're looking at it in terms of this Hall of Fame series? Because if I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head if there are other French history wrestlers in the Hall of Fame, and I don't think there's two. You're pointing at two outside of Raul, I'm assuming. I'm trying to remember. Do you remember off the top of your head who they are?
And they got in within, I want to say, the last 10 years or so. It's Henri de Glan, who was the top star for Pauli, and Paul Pons, who was the top Greco-Roman star in the early 1900s. And both were obviously auto inductions, obviously.
Yeah, and that's early 1900s, so that's even later. But this is, I guess, to a degree, a more modern candidate.
Yeah, I mean, along with de Glan, because they were of the same time.
That's true. That's true. So that's my question for you, is that, obviously we're getting more people in here, and this is now an auto induction, and we haven't really gotten to the point of a proper induction. But do you think there could be any sort of change, any sort of additional movement towards these sort of French catch wrestlers that we're talking about, like La Petit Prince or Gébert?
I don't think that necessarily Pauli's induction affects that, but to me, why I quite like the induction of Pauli is because he's the first European promoter of any country to get into not just the Observer Hall of Fame, any Hall of Fame of the big ones. So to me, that's a step in the right direction, because he's probably, and that's why I pushed for him, I should say, is because he's probably one of the most influential ones ever in terms of Europe. So I think he's a worthy first name to have. But there are others who are worth considering, and I think this is a step in that direction more so than wrestlers, I would say.
So if anything, it would maybe affect the non-wrestler promoter side of things, which, look, I'm more than happy to throw 5 more names into that non-wrestler pool bucket. You know what?
Yeah.
30 people? Let's throw in a couple more. Who cares? Well, that's great. I think that's a very solid answer. And yeah, I mean, obviously we talked about Gébert last year. We'll talk about it a little bit more later when we talk about the rest of the world ballot. He's still on 23.4% is what he got. So I think that's, for me, that for a solid start. Next, we'll talk about it more in about an hour or so, but very going to be tough region, I would say, with the amount of people potentially falling off. So I'm interested to see how anyone is going to do next year. But let's start talking about Le Petit Prince and start talking about him. I don't know. Do you want to start with the sort of background on him? Obviously, Daniel Dubail
Yeah,
I want
well,
to say
in French it's actually Dubai, but yeah, in English that works. Yeah,
Dubai. Okay, I like Daniel Dubai. That Daniel Dubai is an indie wrestler name.
right.
For sure. Daniel Dubai. He has a sort of background in judo wrestling and gymnastics. I think I saw somewhere that there was a potential. I didn't see it cited, so I'm not gonna. This is secondhand for sure, but sort of potential that he was looking towards the Olympic sort of situation for. I want to say gymnastics. I want to say is what it was, but there was an injury that paused that. He was also in love with Greco-Roman wrestling, and through that was able to start wrestling in the quote unquote big leagues in mid 1960s. So there's a that's kind of the starting point. You know, learning, training, starting in the big fairs and festivals, and then started working on TV in 1966, and those are sort of the beginnings of his career.
Yeah. Well, let's take it to the beginning. Let's start from there. So he was born in 1943, so right in the middle of the Second World War,
Mm-hmm.
in a small town close to the Swiss border. And actually, he himself obviously was first generation Frenchman, but his mother was Italian and his father was Swiss. So he's from Swiss Italian descent. And he was part of a big family, three older sisters, I should say, and four younger brothers. And as you said yourself, growing up, he first did judo, did that for a little bit. Then he transitioned to gymnastics, where he was actually successful on the national level. And indeed, he did have Olympic aspirations, but injury prevented that. And then he also got into Greco-Roman wrestling, amateur Greco-Roman wrestling, along with three of his brothers who were also amateurs like that. And he did some stuff. He had some success on the local and regional level, but nothing on the national level or anything like that. And then in the meantime, he became a professional wrestling fan as well, because at this point, we're talking the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
So wrestling was on TV, there were local shows. So him and his brothers, I mean, there is this interview with his mother where she was telling, the very typical story that you would expect, that their room was always turning into a wrestling ring. They were fighting each other all the time. And also his brother, who he was closest with in terms of wrestling, was Jean-Pierre, was his name. And his brother told the story in an interview where after gymnastics practice, they would take away the gymnastics equipment, put down the wrestling mats, and start doing pro wrestling moves. So Daniel was a big time professional wrestling fan. And see, in France, all the way back to the early days of professional wrestling, those would be the late 1820s, that's 1-8, and
Mm-hmm.
1830s. Obviously, wrestling started at the fairs, the carnivals, etc. And back then, they were doing the whole thing where this is the professional wrestler. Anybody from the crowd, do you want to take me on? And even as late as the 1960s, this was still happening in France. They were still wrestling at fairs, carnivals, and there was still a professional wrestler taking on all comers from the crowd. Now, just a quick note about that, because it's interesting. Those wrestlers participating in those types of matches, some of them were from the proper big leagues, some of them were strictly at the fair circuit. So it wasn't, because it was a professional wrestling, but kind of a different type of it, like more, I would say, semi-professional, because the fairs weren't a full-time thing.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so Daniel and Jean-Pierre specifically, they used to go to these local fairs and they would try to volunteer to wrestle the wrestler. But as the story goes, as told by his brother, I guess the manager of the troupe there was always turning him down. You're too small, because this was when they were maybe about 14, 15, that sort of age, 16. And eventually what happened is one of the managers was like, hey, listen, I'm not going to let you wrestle my wrestler, but if you want, you can do an exhibition. And that's how they got in. They started, Jean-Pierre and Daniel, the two brothers, started having exhibition matches at these fairs, festivals, etc. Not on a full-time basis, just something on the side, obviously. But that's what happened. And this was while he was still in his teens. So he
Mm-hmm.
was very young when he started doing that. And then back then in France, there was conscription. So he went into the army for 18 months, which was mandatory back then. He went into the uh, Air Force, I believe. And after he got out, by that time, actually, he already was married. He had two kids, a daughter and a son. So this gets us to 1965. And 1965, he was still doing the fairs, but also back then, you see what would happen is on the regional shows, pro wrestling shows, proper shows with the TV stars and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they would do it where the opening match would be an amateur match. Now, when I say amateur, it could be one of two things. Either it could be like a proper amateur match, Greco-Roman, freestyle, whatever, or it could be an amateur match in a sense of a couple of guys doing professional wrestling, but they were unlicensed wrestlers. Therefore, they were technically classified as amateurs. So Daniel on some local shows started doing these types of amateur matches. And this is how he got noticed, actually, by doing an amateur match on a pro show, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So this was 65. Now, he himself, and usually in stories about him, you would read that he got his start in the big leagues, quote unquote, in 66. No, it was definitely 65. There are results, but even he himself would always say 66. So this is where probably the confusion comes through. And he was probably saying it because that's when he got on TV. So that's kind of more official, so to speak. So yeah, that's how he got discovered. And the guy who discovered him actually was a pretty big player in the French pro wrestling business. That was a guy by the name of, I'll first say it in English, which would be something like Robert Lagat. In French, this will be Robert Laget. So Leger discovered him, and a quick note about Leger, because he's really a quite important figure. He was an amateur wrestler back in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Then, as Pauli introduced American-style professional wrestling to France, Lagat or Leger switched to being a professional. Then, in World War II, he got shot by the Nazis, and that pretty much very badly, in fact, and this pretty much ended his career. So then after the war, he actually became a manager. Now, when I say a manager, that doesn't mean like the on-screen heel manager cutting promos, interfering in matches. That's not what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Back then in French wrestling, because it was largely modeled after boxing, there were these manager guys who were exactly like managers in boxing. Guys who kind of helped guys take bookings, negotiated their bookings, negotiated their rates, and they would get a 10% cut as a,
Like a
as
proper like
a
agent or manager of like
yeah,
in like a film
proper,
sort of sense too.
exactly. And the thing with Leger is that he was actually one of the higher level managers. I mean, for example, he was managing at the time being the late 40s. For example, he was managing Charles Rigoulot, who was a former Olympic gold medalist in weightlifting, who then became one of the biggest French stars. I mean, top 3 for sure up to that point. And he was also managing another Olympian by the name of Axel Kadir from Sweden, who actually, just a quick note about that because it's interesting as well. Axel Kadir, on credentials alone, on paper, is, I would say for sure, the most credible, the most notable amateur to ever become a full-time professional wrestler. Why? Because he was a 4-time world champion in amateur wrestling, 3 times Greco-Roman, 1 time freestyle. He was also a 2-time Olympic champion, 1 time gold, 1 time, I want to say, bronze. So on credentials alone, there's been no higher amateur to get into the business than him. Not Karenko, not any of those guys who were just like 1-time champions, whatever. But he was legit, and he was another one of Leger's guys. But anyway, just very quickly to wrap up the thing. Sorry, did you want to say anything?
No, just sort of say that was just sort of the just commenting. I was like, oh, that's really great. That the biggest amateur. He went on to be a manager. I think he was also trained under Michel Saunier.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. He was indeed. But yeah,
just wanted back on track, and I nailed it.
No. But I do want to wrap up Leger because it would get us to the promotion, to quickly explain what sort of promotion Daniel got into.
Yeah.
So then what happened is in 1950, Leger got suspended for life. It's a whole story. I'm not going to get into it, but it's one of the most important moments in French pro wrestling history for a number of moments. From there, he hooked up with a guy by the name of Etienne Siri, who was an up-and-coming boxing promoter. And the two of them started their company, their promotion and also a booking office. And they also created a French pro wrestling's second governing body for professional wrestling, which was the so-called FFCP. And this is how we get to the promotion that hired Daniel, Le Petit Prince, as we say. So 65, Leger discovers him. They have him move over to Paris, and they actually train him at their wrestling school to become a proper professional wrestler. Because yes, he had wrestled on the fairs, but that was a different thing.
Yeah,
it was he didn't have proper training.
He had to go to NXT, work the Largo loop, and figure out where the hard camera was.
Yeah, pretty much. And the interesting thing, a point to make about this is that I think the fact that Daniel did not start the regular way, I think And we will talk about his in-ring later, but I think that fact is probably a big reason why he was so unique as a worker. Because if he had gone the regular route, trained from scratch at the regular wrestling school, it's very likely they would have squashed his creativity, his style.
Yeah.
Whereas he had a few years to work it out, did whatever he wanted pretty much on these fairs, and then Leger saw him, saw the style already pretty much created, liked it, and went with it. So I think that's an important point to make as to how he developed.
Yeah. So then he starts training. He moves to Paris. He's trained under Michel Saulnier.
So
Nailing it.
yeah.
I felt confident with that one, as you could tell. And started working at that. That is also, I guess, sort of important for who his trainer was, because eventually he'll have like a series of draws with Michel during late '60s, where Michel is I forget what he's a lightweight champion. I don't remember which tier he was. World lightweight champion at the time. He has a series of draws with them, so that sort of continuation of important notes from him. And then he starts working under Duran's promotion, if I'm not mistaken.
Not exactly, because Durant was a partner of Leger. He was working for Leger,
Okay.
but also for Durant because they were working together at the time. But before we get to the actual debut, a couple more points I want to hit here because I think they're important. The first thing is his size. Now, Daniel,
yes.
He was really, really small. I mean, even for wrestling today.
Yeah, well, to put it in context, I was trying to find sort of a modern wrestler to give you that context. His billing height was like 5'1", 119, if I'm not mistaken. That is the exact build height of Io Shirai. So if you want a comp, build a little bit different, I would say. But if you wanted a comp, it is just watch Io Shirai. That is the exact size person for Le Petit Prince. There is no one. He would have been shorter than like Rey Mysterio, who I believe is 5'4". I looked up a bunch of wrestlers' heights right before this. I think like AEW's like shortest guy was like John Skyler, and I think he was also 5'4". So we're talking like someone who's even smaller and incredibly thin as well. Like just basically a little bit same height, but a little bit heavier than like Riho from AEW. So we're talking about an incredible, especially on a male scale, an incredibly small guy.
Yeah, and actually about the height, because usually they would say 5'1", but I think it was actually closer to 5'2", which is pretty much the same. But just to throw this in, and as far as the weight, his built weight was 54 kg, so that's about 119 pounds, which he was wrestling in the lightweight category back then because that was the smallest. But if you think about it, he was a flyweight in UFC or a bantamweight in boxing, something like that. So really, really small. Now, the other point I wanted to hit, actually, speaking of being small and disadvantaged physically, another interesting thing that I find very curious about him is that he had really, really bad eyesight as well. Like when he made his debut, he was 22 years old, obviously in 23, I should say, well, 22 and 65. He had a diopter of 8, which if you know anything about diopters, having diopter of 8 at 22, that's
he is blind.
Practically, yeah. And if you watch the matches, you would see him walking out with these big glasses for all of his matches, usually. So yeah, obviously the sight got worse, which when you think about how good he was in the ring with that bad of an eyesight, it's even more impressive.
I won't even think about that. Just putting that on top of what I'm already prepped to say about like his wrestling ability, to then say, and he's practically blind in there, is insane to think about. Oh my God.
Yeah. Yep. Now, another point I'll make here before we move on to the actual debut and everything else is the name. See, that's another brilliant thing that's not another thing. That's just the most brilliant thing that they did, which is give him the name, the Little Prince. Now, the first thing I'll say here, though, is that sometimes people don't realize that actually his wrestling name technically wasn't Little Prince. Technically, his wrestling name was Alberic. That's the name they gave him, at least in '65. Alberic de Héricourt, which, plain name, nothing much to it. It has a kind of a noble, kind of a, I don't know what you even call it. But anyway, point is, but what happened is the the French announcer Roger Coderc apparently came up with the name The Little Prince. And the name, obviously, for those who are not aware, comes from, there is this French book from the 1940s by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It's about this pilot who gets stranded in a desert, meets a boy who's this, claims to be this prince from an asteroid. So The Little Prince. So this is what the book is about. It's technically a children's book, but it has like a deeper meaning as well. So Coderc saw this wrestler, Daniel, and he was like, this should be the Little Prince, which when you think about it, it's just brilliant branding because it immediately makes him memorable. The Little Prince of Wrestling. If he was just playing Alberic de Ricourt, I don't think he would have had the same effect, and I don't think he would have been as successful. I mean, obviously, still the same qualities in the ring, but just marketing-wise, it was brilliant move. Brilliant move. So
and
now
he's,
that we
he's
have
ultimately also going to become practically an exhibition, not exhibition. What's the special attraction? That's the word I'm trying to use. So using that, when you want a special attraction, you want like really good branding to that, and just saying like, hey, look, remember this children's book? It's come to life in the ring right in front of you, and it's going to be this amazing, not technically high flying acrobatic feats in the ring. So it makes sense as part of that branding for a special attraction.
Yeah, brilliant branding and marketing. So now we get to the debut. Now he technically debuted as far as the live events in the fall of 65 after training obviously for a while, but the big presentation, the big unveiling was of course the following year on television. And that happened. Well, usually you would read in articles about him, and even he himself has said it, that his first appearance on television was against Andre the Giant in February. And that is true. They did do a segment on Andre on the news, and which was Andre's second television appearance ever, a day after his first. And Daniel was wrestling Andre Day, obviously the juxtaposition, the giant with the little guy. But actually, his debut was on January 23rd, so a couple weeks before that, as far as I can tell, against Michel Falimpin, another wrestler, which of course, even Daniel himself would say Andre because it just sounds more impressive.
It does. Yeah, well, it's Andre the Giant. I mean, everyone knows who that guy is, so why not?
Yeah. So they do the TV debut, and then in that same year, he wrestles another 3 matches on television. So in total, he has 4 matches on television in 1966, which actually, and we'll talk about why, because I think it's very interesting, it's a crazy number. And at first glance, it doesn't seem like a crazy number, but it is actually an absolutely crazy number for him to have 4 matches on French television in the same calendar year. Now, let's break it down. Let's explain it. I'll get a little bit too long-winded in here, but I think it's worth it. You see what I mean in the end.
I'll break it up with my nonsense. No worries.
So the first thing to remember here is that French pro wrestling never aired on television every single week. Never, ever. At most, they were doing 30-something broadcasts per year. And most years, it was even less than that. So from what I can tell, that year, 1966, there were 32 wrestling broadcasts for the whole year. And back then, there were 3 television networks in France. All 3 were public, state-owned and operated, and 2 of them were airing wrestling. So just the third one was not. So
I may be confusing this with England. Was it because also French, they had an off season for the wrestling? Am I correct in that?
They did. Yeah, kind of. Yeah, the schedule in the summer was a lot lighter in general.
Quote unquote off season, but they had a lighter summer schedule.
But also the promoters themselves, I mean, it kind of fluctuated over the time, but they didn't like having too many broadcasts anyway. Yeah. They kind of like to keep it limited.
That sounds extremely French.
Yeah. No, there were business reasons behind it, but we won't get into it here. So anyway, so 32 broadcasts for the whole year. Now, let's peel another layer here. Now, when I say broadcast, the other thing you have to know and remember here is that back then, the French broadcasts, there were 1 match. That was it. Maybe a part of a second match, like a few minutes, but it was always 1 match. So when I say 32 broadcasts, what I'm really saying is for the whole year, out of the hundreds of wrestlers that were active in France, there were only 32 matches. So only a very limited number of guys could be featured, obviously, in those 32 matches.
Yeah.
And remember, Daniel was in 4 of those 32, which sounds good, but it's still not anything too crazy. And now here's where it starts to get crazy. The other important thing you have to remember is that back then in France, the wrestling scene was largely divided between 4 booking offices based in Paris that kind of controlled wrestling in France. And they also were sharing the television. So when I say 32 broadcasts, that's 32 broadcasts between 4 companies, basically. So And the way I have it here, I'm looking at it here. I have my numbers in front of me. That year, there were 9 broadcasts by the Alex Goldstein promotion, 8 by the Roger Delaport promotion, 4 by the Maurice Durand promotion, 6 by the City and Lager promotion, and 5 unknown that I know there were broadcasts. I just don't know what era. But let's be generous and take a couple of those 5 that I don't know what was on and give them to the Lager promotion. Let's say they had 8 broadcasts for the entire year. Now, do you realize how crazy it is that they had 8 matches on television for the whole year, and 4 of them they gave to this guy, this flyweight guy who's basically, in a way, a rookie. It's just insane. 50% or more.
That is kind of crazy. The available TV time for their promotion, 50% of 50% of a match, 50% of 50% or whatever. 50% of those matches that you aired were with the Prince. I think that is insane. pretty crazy stuff.
50% or more, because again, I'm assuming there's a couple of matches that were there.
Sure.
So even more potentially. Now imagine what the other guys will feel like. They were probably fuming. But anyway, let's not get off track. So that's the crazy thing about his first year. But what it shows though is that they were really high on him straight from the beginning, and they wanted to make him a star as quickly as possible, and they were really high on him. And speaking of the TV, a couple other points I want to make here that are also interesting. The other point is this: like we said, 2 of the 3 networks were airing wrestling, and Daniel actually, in May, a match of his aired on the one network, and then 5 days later on the other network. So within 5 days on the 2 networks, which I may be wrong, but I don't know that that's ever happened with anyone else in the history of French pro wrestling. I mean, I'd have to check my notes, but I can't recall an instance. So that's something as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And the other thing is an interesting comparison to make. Now, who was the other guy that they were pushing that year? Andre the Giant. And how many matches did Andre the Giant have on television in 1966? 0. Which, now granted, in fairness, I think he may have been one of those 5 unaccounted for. Maybe. I don't think so, to be honest, but maybe. And also, he was really, really green. He had his first match in January. So they were probably, keeping him off TV for that reason. But just on the surface, if you were to go to a wrestling promoter or a wrestling fan, and you go, here's this little guy here, and here's this giant, who would you put 50% of the entire year on TV? I mean, I think nobody,
It's almost like speaking to what eventually will become of Andre and Prince to a degree, like an inflection point of I wonder if a big what if, a massive what if, because it includes Andre the Giant, is where does Petit Prince go in his career if Andre never showed up? Because at a certain point it becomes, Andre's the biggest star in the world. You know what I mean? So I wonder if where does Prince go if Andre didn't exist? But that's fascinating because look, maybe that's Vince brain, of oh, look at this big guy, look at this big dude that I'm gonna put on my television. But that also brings up another question I had for you is that and I don't know if you have in your research because this is, I think, a great companion audio piece to the Gébert episode we did last year, because you'll hear a lot more about the sort of setup structure of French wrestling and the TV and the promotions through that episode as sort of a backing track to this episode. But is there sort of any research or evidence that sort of suggests why they were giving Prince so much? Was it that his style was so innovative to French catch? Was it that, he was super hot, a lot of crowds were coming to him? I know he didn't really wrestle in massive stadiums or anything, but, small, mid-sized venues. Was there something, was there any sort of reason that you can find of why he is getting half the TV time for this one promotion?
I can only assume. I mean, as far as concrete evidence, I don't have any, but my assumption is that they just were really high on him and they just wanted to make him a star really, really quickly. And how do you do that? By focusing as much airtime as you can on him, getting him exposed as much as you can. I mean, again, I'm just assuming, but I think that's what happened. And actually, speaking of Andre, speaking of attractions, this actually ties into my next point, for which I'll send you just a quick link because I want you to be. Folks. I want you to be looking at it as I'm explaining it to the listeners as well. And this is from my Twitter. I posted it a while back, like in June last year. It's a very interesting. Well, it's basically what it is I don't know exactly what it is, but it sure looks like Etienne Siri's business card, if you will. Because what I'm looking at here, it's definitely from late '66. I can say that, and it's basically like a flyer, and on top there's the name of Etienne Siri. Then it says manager matchmaker, his address, his telephone number, mentions that he's doing television broadcasts for uh, French TV and Luxembourg TV. And then it says, I offer the best shows, I have the biggest stars, I have over 100 wrestlers. And then there are 4 names mentioned on that flyer. So on his business card, he thought that these 4 names were the key names to put. And the 4 names are, on the left, we have René Benchimou. On the right, we have Annie Vignau, a female wrestler. Then there's Andre the Giant, who is listed as the #1 attraction. And then we have right in the middle, a big photo of Le Petit Prince. And I think this is quite interesting, and it speaks to how much value they saw in him. Because now let's take out Shimu out of the equation, because technically he was actually part of another promotion and actually helping run it. But at the time they were working together, so that's why he's probably here. But
Big
technically he's
star from
not.
another promotion coming to bolster.
Yeah, but technically he's not part of the Siri ranks and Leger ranks. Then on the right, we have obviously the female wrestler. Now, at the time, female wrestling was catching a lot of steam in France, building steam. So that's why she's on there. It was like a brand new special attraction. And then really we have the core of it all, the 2 stars. We have Prince, we have Andre. So in the eyes of Siri, it sure looks like in his eyes, those were his key stars in '66, late '66. So essentially not even a year into both of their debuts, which is quite important, and it shows how valued he was, how high they were on him. And
one thing to note here, just because I'll put a link of this in the episode description so people can see the picture themselves. But just for the audio listeners, and I don't know if this is because maybe people know what he looked like or what for any reason, but Prince is directly dead center of this flyer. Andre, no picture whatsoever. It just says, "Hey, we got Andre here as the #1 attraction," but there's no picture of Andre the Giant at all in this picture.
Yeah, to be fair though, the flyer, I think it's a little bit cut off at the bottom, but still, I think it doesn't.
Phil, keep it going.
Anyway, yeah, I like to clarify.
It's plausible that directly underneath is
Yeah, like a little photo. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the irony, the big photo of the small guy, the little photo of the giant. Yeah, but yeah, so yeah, that's pretty much tells you what they thought of him, from what I can tell.
Oh, and, especially in that 66 years that they see him as their, I mean, not their #1, I guess they're saying Andre, at least #2 special attraction. For context as well, since we talked about that there's these other 4 promotions, what is sort of since he is one of the big stars of this one promotion of what is it, Siri is how you pronounce it? The Siri Leger promotion. What is sort of the size scope of it? Are we talking like a big national stage? Are we talking sort of smaller indie sort of style? What is sort of the size of the promotion compared to the other promotions we talked in the past?
Well, I mean, they're all relatively the same size, all 4 of them. I mean, one may be a little bit bigger than the others. It's tough to say, but they were all relatively the same sort of size. And but I would say this though, in terms of, I don't know that I would call him their second biggest star. I think he was just someone who, because obviously this is something like a business card. So you want to put and I guess he used this business card in order to, at least it appears to me anyway, to attract potential local, because remember now maybe we have to track back a little bit. Back then the business model was these big 4 booking offices, what they were doing is they were promoting their own shows in Paris, but the rest of the time they were leasing out talent to all these local promoters to put on shows. So a lot of their revenue, as a matter of fact, I would say most of their revenue was coming from booking out the talent. So I think by putting on Prince, who by this point would have been 4 times on TV, very recognizable, and Andre, obviously being Andre, I think this kind of, maybe for people who don't know much about wrestling, but maybe are interested, maybe putting on a show, I think this is a selling point. So it's kind of like not necessarily the biggest stars, but the ones that are most recognizable in terms of the TV. And because Andre actually, let me just mention quickly, he wasn't on TV, but they were pushing him a lot in the media, like in the papers. So he was building up quite a reputation as well, but in another way. So yeah, I mean, this is what I meant here in terms of that. And I was going to say though, the other thing. So obviously now by this point they've built him up on TV. This is how they made him into a television star. But the next thing they did, which is something that you alluded to earlier, are the matches with Michel Saunier. Now Saunier, an excellent wrestler himself, but also, as you mentioned, he actually trained Le Petit Prince once he joined the promotion. He also trained Andre the Giant as well, by the way. So he was the same guy. And at the time, Saunier was the world lightweight champion. So then in 67, 68, 69, they had him work television draws with Prince. 3 television draws, which what does that tell you? Basically, they were telling the audience, hey, listen, this little Prince guy, every bit as good as the world champion. He's not the world champion, but he's up there. So this was the message they were clearly trying to send.
They're adding credibility to him as a wrestler. He's not just a special attraction. He is a world title contender.
Yeah. And this actually leads us to the next thing, which is also another interesting thing about his career. Now, as far as I can tell, he never won any singles championships during his career, and he wrestled for 24 years full time, which is maybe odd at first glance. Now, I also say he may have been tag team champion at one point. I haven't been able to confirm, possibly, but singles, no. And even in articles, he never mentioned any titles, nothing like that. So I really think he didn't win anything. And like I said, it may seem weird at first glance, but I think it ties back into this special attraction thing that I keep bringing up here, and you keep bringing up, is because that was his role. His role wasn't to be a main event star. His role wasn't to be a champion. His role was to be something special, something extra on that card, usually in the mid card. So that's what he was there for, and that's why he never needed championships. That's why they never put championships on him.
I find that also fascinating because it's going to these 3 years in a row. I wonder if there was an idea of like almost like refreshing the credibility. Not that necessarily, he constantly need it or something like this, but this idea of like, it's like, oh yeah, he's not just like a guy that will go out and have a mid card high flying thing. It's like, no, he's a legit wrestler that we need to remind our audience to a degree of like, no, he is a legit wrestler. He's going to go against the world champion and have a really fun. I was literally watching one of the matches right before we got on. A really outstanding babyface performance where this is a world champion who is practically just hammer locking, wrist locking, head locking the entire match, and it's all about Prince trying to like get out of it and find creative ways and showcasing those ways, but ultimately like then getting in his own sort of like hammer locks and stuff on Michel and presenting it as such a way of like, I'm on your level, I can do the same thing that you can do. So it's very interesting to do that, but at the same time, the thing that I also think about when I hear that topic of conversation is I do think about, I don't know if you'll appreciate this, but I am just thinking about past episodes that we've recorded. I'm thinking about last year's, and I do just think about that there are these special attraction guys that aren't necessarily world champions or anything, but guys like Les Kellett, who is like a special attraction in a completely different sense. Les Kellett is probably one of the best comedic wrestlers of all time. He's an obvious special attraction, and firmly in that mid card region. Oh, if I recall, no, he did have a couple championships at a couple different times, but definitely like a guy that is like, this is to a degree a special attraction sort of thing because his special attraction is comedic wrestling to a certain degree. That's what Prince is bringing to the table. This is a guy who is one of the best high flyers. I would have to imagine one of the best high flyers in the region. That it kind of leads us to the working ability a little bit, but I have to imagine that's probably the case. We'll talk more about it maybe in a second, but that is the attraction. It is you are going to see something that you have never seen before, and it is a guy that he is a serious contender. He is always going to be important to us, and he should be important to you, and that's what they kind of establish with these draws against Michel.
Yeah, let's get a little French with it, though. Let's not say high flyers. Let's not say high flyers. That's not the proper term. They actually had a term for guys like him and René Benchimol before him. The term is voltigeur, which basically means acrobat. And actually, which actually Prince was known. He had another nickname that he had was Le Roi des Voltigeurs, meaning the king of the acrobats. That was another one of his nicknames. So yeah, but yeah,
That's perfect.
that was it. Now let's move on with the career, though. Another kind of point to make here is that now he worked primarily in France,
Hmm.
obviously, but he also, as soon as 66, he started working in Switzerland and Belgium a lot. They had a working connection with France, obviously. Then later, he also was in Spain for a tour. He was in the UK for a tour, actually even had a TV match, which
Hmm.
unfortunately is not available. I would have loved to see it, but anyway.
Maybe
Yeah,
one of these
so
days.
maybe, who knows? He was also in Africa as well. I don't know the exact countries, but it was probably Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. Those were the ones connected with the French territory, and pretty much every French star worked there. So he worked a little bit abroad, but he was primarily based in France for a number of reasons. But also remember, he was a family man. Actually, especially in the summer, he traveled around to the shows along with his family. It was like a big family trip in a caravan. So yeah, I mean, he stuck to France. So there's not much of an international career to speak to. I mean, there is a little bit, but just not a lot.
Yeah.
So that's another point to make as far as him.
He sort of goes out to see his family, go on holiday, probably to a degree of his, because like you said, he's starting out in the business and he already has two young ones, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So he's going out, making building up a star credibility, making some money, come back home, or even bringing the family probably to go on holiday or something, or going up to Switzerland, see his what was it, his mother's family. So
Mm.
I'm sure there's reasons there.
Well, actually, this ties into my next theme actually perfectly as well. He was traveling to show with the family to shows because they were
Hmm.
doing like in the summer, they were in the French territory. They were doing big tops shows
Yes.
under a big top, and it was like a traveling attraction. This actually ties into my next point, which is that he was known as one of the biggest workhorses of French pro wrestling. I mean, reportedly, I've no way of verifying, but reportedly he was working as many as 250 matches a year, which, if you know anything about the French rings back then, which were basically hard boxing rings, I
Yeah.
can't imagine this was any good on the body, especially with his style. But that's what he was doing. And even as late as 1977, he's mentioning in interviews that, hey, I'm working 150 matches per year. And this is in an industry that's rapidly declining and not as popular, but he's still keeping very, very busy. So he was a
Yeah.
workhorse and working all the time. He only had wrestling on his mind. So this brings us actually to pretty much the end of his career, which was the active career ended in 89 because he had a very bad car accident that broke his leg, and that pretty much ended it. He did wrestle a couple more matches in the 90s, and then in 2001 he came back after many years away for a one-off Legends match, but the active career ended in 89. And now, unfortunately, though, the final years of his career were kind of sad in a way because what happened is, well, two things happened. Now, first of all, he was a big spender. He did not save any money whatsoever. He liked living large. He was spoiling his kids. He was spoiling his wife, buying expensive furniture. He apparently liked big American cars, so he was buying big American cars, and he was not saving whatsoever. And like we said, all he had on his mind was wrestling. That's pretty much the only job he ever had.
Yeah.
And then as the industry started going down, the crowds became less, the money became less, the bookings became less, the injuries accumulated, things started getting rough financially for him. And then obviously the big injury happened. He couldn't really find a job. The employment agency couldn't do anything for him because he had no skills other than wrestling. So he collected the employment for a while, then did odd jobs here and there. But yeah, things financially weren't good towards kind of the end of his career and beyond. But he was making ends meet though, ultimately. But yeah, and then as luck would have it, he actually got cancer and went to chemotherapy. Obviously, that made him kind of very physically weak.
Yeah.
And then, out of nowhere, one day, he just decided to move to Thailand, of all places. Now, he did mention in interviews that his goal while there was to open actually a wrestling school and create a Thailand wrestling scene because he thought that Southeast Asia had potential as a wrestling market, whereas he thought France was at this point a bit of a lost cause as far
Of
as
course.
restarting things there locally. So he went to Thailand, didn't take much with him, pretty much left all his belongings with his daughter, everything like memorabilia, etc. And then he just passed away there, and that was in 2005. And I'll say here something, and I'm not speaking out of turn because his daughter, I've seen her mention it as well. Oh, and by the way, quick shout out to his daughter. I've been speaking to her a little bit. She's been a great help to me. and her Facebook page would be in the link of the podcast dedicated to her father. So check it out.
She's been
But
kind of doing a great job of keeping up her legacy, because I think I talked about that documentary I was trying to look into. I think if I recall correctly, it was like written by her, or she was a big producer part of that documentary. She was listed in the credits, so
she was involved.
She's very much pushing his legacy forward.
Yeah, but this is something she's mentioned, and I think that's probably what happened. Is I think it's not so much that he wanted to open a wrestling school as well, but I think what he ultimately wanted is to just kind of die in peace. In Thailand, where his income also would have meant more, he would have been able to have a more comfortable life. So I think ultimately that's what happened, which is a bit of an unfortunate ending, but it is what it is.
Exactly. It is what it is. But yeah, no, at the end of the day, you're looking at a 20-25 year career for Prince, starting 65, ending 89, a year or two, not really a year, but a match or two here a little bit later. But you're looking ultimately at a 20-25 year career, a guy who is this, as we talked about, an insanely high level acrobatic wrestler. I think that kind of transitions perfectly into that first section for the observer qualifications, that is working ability. Like I said, an insanely high level acrobatic ability. This is a guy that in the 60s, 70s, 80s is working this style. Many a times when I'm doing research, I'm looking to see just what people are looking, other people's opinions on like their wrestlers' wrestling ability. Like, hey, is this guy a good wrestler? Is there a conversation? When people watch Le Petit Prince, they the immediate first name that is almost always brought up to him is Tiger Mask, is Sayama Tiger Mask. I'll see early Rey Mysterio. I'll see Liger up there as well. You're looking at like one of the best of the best. And what I find so fascinating, and obviously we can get into more granular detail about his working ability, and I think it also is an extremely great seller as well, which I think is sort of, I imagine it's a little bit of that Michelle upbringing, because Michelle works a little bit hard-nosed, technical, stiffer probably. But what I find interesting is obviously like, Liger, Mysterio, Tiger Mask. The thing that all these guys have in common as well is that they worked in Mexico, and they worked in the lucha libre aesthetic of professional wrestling. Whereas Petit Prince never did that. As far as I can tell, never did a tour in Mexico and learned all these sort of things. It was just sort of a acrobatic gymnast style that he had growing up, that he then took into the ring and evolved the style from there. And I don't know, you might have a better knowledge of this, Phil, than I do, if there were other extremely acrobatic wrestlers prior to Petit Prince. Like maybe there was somebody on TV that he was watching that influenced him in that regard as well. But this is a guy that, what I'm trying to say is, as far as I know, and you can tell me wrong here, this is a guy that ultimately helped develop a professional wrestling style, ultimately that what everyone else ends up doing, but a professional wrestling style by himself, that wasn't really outside influence, outside of his own gymnastic aerobatic abilities. And I think that is insanely impressive, and he was practically blind. Was there anything else like, and that's the thing, right? That's the special attraction to it all, is was there anyone else prior to him that had a similar wrestling style, or was this a style that he truly developed in this region?
As far as I'm aware, nobody quite like him. I mean, there were guys like René Benchimou is an example. He was considered the premier voltigeur acrobat before him. But if you watch René, he did a lot of athletic stuff, fast stuff, but he wasn't doing the flips that Prince was doing or anything like that. So Prince's style was unique, completely unique on his own, and just total credit to him and him alone, nobody else. And now
that's I have to point that out. That is truly insane to me.
It is, and today we're in perfect sync, because I was going to bring up something about Tiger Mask just right now, and you gotta beat me to it. But yeah, the case of really, I mean, the reason why, let's not make any bones about it. The reason why Prince is on this ballot is because of his work.
Yeah.
That's the main reason. And I think the case of his in-ring work is twofold. First is exactly that. He's one of the most ahead of his time wrestlers ever. I mean, obviously, we don't have footage of every single wrestler in history, obviously, but based on the available footage, he sure looks like it. And and this next point I'm about to make, it's, don't read it wrong. It's not about me. It's not even about the number. But just a couple weeks ago, for the TV debut, on my Twitter, I posted a compilation to celebrate 60 years of his television debut. Just 1 minute of Le Petit Prince footage. And between my post and a Japanese, I guess, reporter perhaps, retweeting it, in 2 days, that clip, that minute of Prince, did over 300,000 views. Now, what wrestler from the 60s is doing 300,000 views? And obviously, it's social media views. It doesn't matter, but the point of it behind it matters. And the point is, even in 2026, people get impressed by this guy from 60 years ago. Now that is kind of wild, but that's the fact. He's just that impressive.
Yeah, it is a style of wrestling, and it's the same sort of thing that people said about like Tiger Mask back in the day. When you see those Tiger Mask Dynamite Kid matches, especially, you say the same sort of thing: is that this is a style that can work today. This is a style of wrestling that is so ahead of its time, and that is sort of and obviously the big difference here between Tiger Mask and Prince is Tiger Mask has a way more influential thing because of that WWF Japanese New Japan sort of thing. A big reason that we'll talk about it more in terms of influence and historical significance. The big reason we're not talking about Prince and that same sort of level in terms of influence is just because of he's in a region that's slowly starting to die and all these sort of things. But what I find so amazing about his working ability is that it is truly of its own thing. It is not influenced by Mexican lucha libre wrestling, which is obviously around decades at this point. Seemingly, I highly doubt he watched any of that to get any sort of idea. I can't imagine they were trading tapes in the 60s. Maybe. But just be able to develop that sort of style and be that fluid and have a style that works, that is ahead of its time by 60s 40 50 60 years. That is predominantly the style of wrestling nowadays. I'm watching these matches, and like I said, I was watching Michelle match, Saulnier match right before, and that match of like the sort of acrobatic, high flying, baby face constantly working underneath and all these sort of things. Trying to find cool technical moves to get out of it versus the sort of more technical guy. There was moments of the match that made me think back to like modern wrestling. Obviously, it made me think about a lot like the sort of to do a modern example, like Darby Allin versus MJF. You have the smaller guy versus MJF, who is similar. He's not massive, you're not Andre or anything, but that bulk of that feud was also like, I'm going to beat you with a headlock and all these sort of things. And that very much felt like the Michelle match where it's like, I'm going to constantly throw on these headlocks over you. And you have to prove to me and the audience how you're going to get yourself out of these sort of situations. And it's a structure. And that's the other thing. It's a structure of match that exists today. It is a style of wrestling that exists today. And that style, and less so the structure, but that style of wrestling, as we're saying here, is a style that seemingly he invented. And I think that is insane to me that because really it's like what other wrestlers can you talk about that with? And it is like you have to go back to the origins of like lucha libre or like the origins of professional wrestling as a whole, of like we're inventing styles. Nowadays, when you talk about this sort of style, you're talking about Purisu. You're talking about the Puro influence. You're talking about a lucha influence. This is a guy that seemingly had neither of it and was still able to get 60 years ahead of it to something that ends up getting influenced by all these other things. Wrestling somehow always goes back and will find a point to these highly athletic, highly acrobatic levels of working. And this is a guy that was able to do it just in his own on the French circus rings. I think that's like that is to me like an insanely high level Hall of Fame wrestling conversation of like, this is a guy that invented a style that will become what wrestling is today 60 years later. I think that's insane.
Yeah, it is. But also let's say this, because sometimes people see the clips, the impressive clips, but the really impressive thing is not the clips. They're the ones that grab the attention, obviously. But the really impressive things are the full matches themselves, because when you watch the actual matches, you realize how truly good this guy was. Yeah, sure, he did impressive acrobatic stuff, but usually the reason why he did them is one of few things: either to get out of a hold, either to get into a hold, or to build to something down the road. So all around, this guy was just a fantastic worker. And I'll say this, because I've had people tell me this, I've read this. If somebody were to come to me and tell me, hey, Phil, I think this guy, Le Petit Prince, is one of the all-time great baby faces. What do you think? Do you agree? Now, I'm not going to say whether I agree or disagree. It's not my call to make. I mean, anybody can make their decision. I don't want to influence people. But what I'll say is this: somebody coming to me with that statement, I wouldn't argue it. I think it's a perfectly valid opinion to have, and I can fully understand how someone can have it after watching all the Prince footage.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that in terms of work.
Yeah, I think there was like a good thread Rob Viper put together talking about Prince. He talked about a little bit of like, you know, it's not just like one match that you watch. It is match after match you watch, you realize more and more of like, okay, this guy knows exactly what he's doing. Like you said, and what I was sort of speaking to with the Michelle matches, of this idea of he's not going out and doing, I mean, to a degree, but he's not necessarily going out and doing high flying acrobatic move sets just in a cornet sort of brain mindset of like just willy-nilly out there. It is structured in the world of professional wrestling. He is doing things as a way to try to evade and get out of holds. He is doing things to try to reverse. He's doing things to put his opponent in a position so that he can put on, it was like, I think he was like doing like a double wrist lock sort of situation or something on the ground, like an arm scissor sort of thing. But he's doing high flying stuff to get back into him. When a wrestler is trying to get out of his ultimate maneuvers or whatever, he is doing high flying acrobatic moves to get back into the move sets. It is what's interesting about that style is that it is not the end result of the wrestling. It is the pathway to get to wrestling moves, is the athleticism, is the acrobatic nature. It is the path to get to a technical hold, which I find so fascinating about his wrestling.
Yeah, it's not the main dish; it's the side dish.
It's a great appetizer. It's a great side dish. You know,
exactly.
And I think, and also to that is like, he has extremely great basics. He has extremely great uppercuts and headbutts in his move set. He has the technicals down extremely well, and he, like we said, he sells extremely well. I think a guy that small gets immediate like baby face buy-in, from a crowd, especially against a guy like Andre the Giant. You're probably like rooting for the like, oh, this guy's gonna die in that ring. But he has this sort of like baby face element where he can get this crowd working, not just in terms of his selling ability, but in terms of also match structures of like a guy that is the ultimate underdog to a degree, in terms of a more basic sense of he because of his size, he is probably always working underneath. And because of his ability, is always able to have these dazzling feats to try to get out and overcome. His superpower is his, for lack of a better term, his superpower is his ability to be acrobatic, to get out of his moves, to overcome his size in the ring, which is what I find, again, I'm giving a lot of praise, but you're right. It is, he deserves the praise in this spot because this is the bulk of his conversation. This is the bulk of his thing. You going out and watching these matches, and we'll have playlists in the link dump below. But he is probably one of the best wrestlers out there in the world, and a Hall of Fame level. I truly think that's plausible, but that is practically what his case pretty much boils down to. Is, before we go into any of that, was there any more? I know I'm taking up a lot of the time here, but is there any more anything I'm missing in regards to his in-ring work that we feel like we're missing out here? Because, like I said, it's truly phenomenal. And you told me that he's blind, so that's crazy to me.
Well, the only thing I'll probably say is that longevity as well. He's great in the footage from 1966. He's still great in the footage from the early 80s. And actually, The very latest footage I've seen from him, it was just a short TV segment from '86, and he's still great in that, still as fast as ever. So he kept it up. He was good all throughout.
At that point, we're talking about a 40-year-old wrestler who's on the same sort of speed and level, which is,
Mm,
I mean, unbelievable.
mm,
That's crazy. But yeah, as we're sort of saying here, is that his wrestling ability is ultimately the bulk of his case. Because then we start moving into, okay, what does the drawing look like? And that's part of that conversation of what's the size of the promotion, where is he kind of wrestling. I think part of it also, this is also kind of, we'll bring up here, like an issue with research and lack of not necessarily research, but lack of information, and having to pull and find specific details and all these sort of things. So we talk about this guy as a special attraction. We talk about this guy as on TV half the time.
at least the
uh,
first year.
just for the first year. Well, I can't imagine he was still on TV a good amount.
He was.
But what is there any sort of like details that we can add into that can present this guy as more than just he's a mid-card special attraction guy? Is there anything that we can sort of say like, oh, here's something we can gravitate towards in terms of a case?
Mm. Well, not factually, so to
Great.
speak.
Oh, it's wrestling. That's fine.
Yeah, but what I can say is this: was he a star? Absolutely. Was
Yeah.
he even, I'll go as far as to say a superstar, to even make it even grander? But he wasn't a main event superstar. He
Yeah.
was never in a position to draw the big crowds. And also in France, by that point, they weren't running big arenas anyway. They were running, a couple thousand, maybe 3, 4, 5 at most. And he did work in a few big arenas in Spain, in Belgium, in Switzerland, even in the UK. Royal Albert Hall is somewhat big,
Yeah.
but he wasn't in a position to affect the draw to such an extent to where you can say, okay, this is the guy that drew the house. Now, I'll say this also. I am sure, I am certain he definitely sold some tickets. I mean, he
Yeah.
was positioned in a way to do so, but he wasn't the main attraction. Now, he did also, let me clarify this. He did main event some shows. It's not like he didn't, but it was usually like smaller regional local shows. It wasn't like the big shows in Paris or in other big towns like that. So was he a draw? Yeah, I'm sure he was to some extent, but was he a Hall of Fame level draw? Absolutely not.
No, and
Absolutely not.
you've also, I believe, brought up early in this episode. He's also wrestling at a point in time, these 20 years, where French wrestling is on a downslope. It is on a decline. I mean, to a degree, Europe as a whole. But he is on a downslope of French wrestling as a whole is on a downslope of popularity. So it's just, there's a lot of stuff working against him on his face when it comes to drawing.
Oh, today we're in perfect sync. I was about to bring this up actually. Yeah. So yeah, that's the point. He got in 65. At the time, the business in France was still doing very, very well, very well. But then by the end of the 60s, that's when the decline started. So when you look at it, he wrestled for 24 years full time.
Yeah.
About 20 of those, it was a business in decline, which also works against him as well.
I really don't think there's much more to go there. So I mean, we'll talk about his influence, and I think to a degree, historical significance, and that is again like not really much, as we sort of said. Wrestling as a whole is sort of on the decline, and as we sort of talked about a little bit of Gilbert Le Duc last time, is that when Parisian wrestling and French catch sort of dies, it kind of just dies. There is nothing real long lasting to a degree that stretches from there. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say die. It never died. It's always been there, but it just
Sure.
got much, much smaller and much culturally relevant, which is really the big thing.
That's fair. That's fair. That's I think a better phrasing here. But yeah, and that's the thing. It's like the influence of it all. Probably not. There's probably not really anything there when it comes to influence. You could you can maybe see that now that we're getting some footage and now we're getting these gifts out there, that maybe there is a chance that a wrestler will see some of these footage or see these clips, see these gifts, and say, oh, look, that's a cool move. Let me go do that in the ring, or let me go try that out, and be influenced in some capacity. But also at the same time, Phil, that is such an incredible hard thing to gauge, because unless it's like you put out a gif and then on Dynamite or something, someone does that move, that it's like, it is so hard to tell, because as we sort of stated, lucha wrestling is so prevalent. The modern style has gotten to this highly athletic, acrobatic moveset standard that is like so incredibly say like even to say like people are getting influenced by these gifts today. How am I supposed to know versus like anyone else, any other thing?
Yeah.
It's so it's so hard to gauge any sort of influence, and even to that extent, historical significance as well.
Mm. Well, let's start with influence because I have a few things to say there.
Please.
Yep, thank you. So the first thing I'll say is this. When he started wrestling, lightweights started getting a little bit more airtime than they did in the past before he came around. But maybe he gets a little bit of credit for that, maybe. But
You need
I
someone to
would,
wrestle, you know?
yeah. But also, I'll say probably the bigger factor at play here. And again, I don't know which comes first, whether it is the chicken or the egg, but I think in general, the talent pool got smaller size-wise. So obviously, when a bigger percentage of your roster is smaller guys, you feature more smaller guys on television. So I
Yep.
don't know whether it was that, whether it was the Prince influence, whether it was both. But there is a little bit of more of a presence on TV for guys of his size, lightweights, I should say. That's the first thing. Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a thought that crossed my mind that I want to kind of circle back to the drawing, and I apologize. This is you stop me, and I'm going to bring it up now. How did the promotion he worked in last, and how did they do in terms of drawing, if you know any of this data, compared to the other promotions that existed?
I cannot say specifically in terms of that, but I'll say actually that's a good point to bring up as well. That promotion went out of business. I don't know the exact year, but at some point in the 70s, I
Okay.
think mostly not, and just the business in general was going down, and they Leger had like a bar that he was running, so nightclub actually, nightclub, and he went and focused on that, so he closed shop. But over the years, Prince worked for all the other promotions pretty much anyway.
Yeah,
But yeah, in terms of drawing, I cannot give you really any concrete numbers because all you
that's
see in the papers is the building was full, but or there was a good crowd. But what does that mean? I mean, I don't know. But
okay.
anyway, let's get back to the influence though, because there's a
Please.
couple of interesting things to mention there. Now, his style, we touched upon it before, but I don't know that his style was very influential in a sense that even in the French territory, I haven't necessarily, in terms of the footage at least, seen anybody that quite did his style. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
sure he influenced some guys, and ultimately his style died with him. But obviously, then it kind of popped up as today's style, which has nothing to do with him. It's
yeah.
just luck, so to speak. But yeah, that's in terms of style. So in that sense, he's an interesting what if, like, because in a lot of ways, like you mentioned earlier, Tiger Mask, in a lot of ways he was like a Tiger Mask, he was like a Rey Mysterio, he was like a, or even throughout Sabu. I mean,
Yeah.
guys who are so different and so ahead of their time that they changed the style, the overall style, to a certain degree. Now, if Daniel had been seen by more people worldwide, could he have been that guy? Could he? Maybe, who knows? But here I'll play my own devil's advocate. I think no. And I think the reason why is because I don't think the world of wrestling as a whole was ready for someone like him. When I say someone like him, I don't necessarily mean style wise, I more so mean size wise.
Yeah.
Because you got to remember, this guy was, well, he wrestled as a lightweight, but he was really a flyweight. So
Yeah.
really, really small. And we're talking the 60s, 70s. Do you think back in the 60s, the US would have had any use for that guy?
No.
Canada, Japan, Australia? No, no use whatsoever. And even Europe, which is where he wrestled, Spain, sorry, not Spain, Germany had no use for such guys. Austria had no use for such guys. Greece had no use for such guys. So even in Europe, it was only certain territories like France, Spain, the UK mainly. So he had a very limited kind of window. Maybe Mexico. Mexico is a good
Yeah.
point, but
Yeah.
I guess a guy like him with a family, I don't see him moving to Mexico for half a year or something like that. So I don't think that was a
Which is
possibility.
another big point, is that he is probably never going to go because of who he is and his family is. He is probably never going to go on those sort of massive international excursions.
Mm,
Whereas, like, he could have easily, like we're saying, he could have. I don't know how he was in terms of friendships or anything. He could have probably uh toured like with Andre, you know, as a not necessarily a dual special attraction sort of thing, but sort of like hop on the same, be his driver, and then I'll work the opener and do some crazy stuff or something. I don't know. You know, he could have done something like that, because at this point, as we said earlier, there's this what if of like, what if Andre never existed? They obviously, the world chose the massive guy versus the smaller guy. But this idea of like, maybe he, in an alternate reality, is that he is like going around the world and influence the world in that degree, and maybe it is a sort of reverse Andre, where it's like, look at the small guy do insane moves. But at the same time, it's like you started saying, he's, because of his family, he's probably never going to do that. The farthest he got was practically the Mediterranean. I guess really the farthest would probably be Switzerland, but that's because that's also his like genetic like lineage, so I can see why he's going up that north. But it's really, it's like he's not going that far. He's not willing to, it's seemingly he's not willing to go that far because he's a family man. He's not going to be bothered, and that's something that obviously hurts his influence, because it is then it becomes truly, and you know, again, if he existed, just if he got to the 90s, maybe he would have had a bigger influence. But the fact that it just sort of, you know, he stretches as far as Europe, and everything starts dying down in the, you know, mid to late 80s for him, it is kind of just like, well, that's kind of it. And it doesn't really, it doesn't break the bubble. It doesn't break the seal at all.
Yeah, so here's very interesting what if, but obviously what ifs, they don't get you voted into the Hall of Fame.
No, they don't.
But actually, let me just give you forget the what ifs. Let me give you a concrete example to back up my theory as to why I don't think the world of wrestling was ready for him.
Agreed.
I'll give you a concrete example. It's a little bit earlier example, but it works. 10 years prior, well, 15 years prior, in 59, René Benchimou and Gilbert Seska actually went on a tour of the United States and Canada. And at the time, those were the premier acrobats of French pro wrestling, and they were welterweight. So again, small guys, bigger than Daniel, but still pretty small. And they went and they actually worked some big arenas. They worked against each other. They wrestled in the Montreal Forum. They wrestled in the Boston Garden. They even did Madison Square Garden. They did that one tour and never were brought back. What does that tell you? Whether it was a case of the promoters didn't see anything in them, whether it was a case of the fans weren't ready for that type of style, I don't know. But the facts are they were never brought back, which tells me the world just wasn't ready for that style of wrestling, you know, outside of certain markets.
Yeah, but again, it goes back to the thing of like, if he was able to survive another decade or something, maybe he would have broken containment. But even then, it's at that point he would have been in his 50s, and that's also not going to happen probably.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. I think it's a size issue. I think it's a containment, you know, issue. It's a sort of not a family issue, because I respect the guy who's, you know, not leaving his family constantly. So yeah, it's difficult to. There's all these what ifs, but it's like, yeah, I totally agree with you that I don't necessarily see that. And even then, it's like, look at like modern wrestling today. Size is still like a thing. It's starting to change. It's starting to break with like, you know, Ring of Honor and you know, Ring of Honor in the 2010s, and then going into sort of like AEW as this light heavyweight, you know, division, or preeminent heavyweight sort of thing. It's like starting to change, but but that's not necessarily you know, that's more of like a thing of like NFL guys aren't becoming or leaving the NFL and becoming wrestlers unless, you know, work in the Largo Loop. So it is this thing of like the big size is still the predominant thing, and even then it's starting to change. But like I said, the smallest guy in like WWE is Rey Mysterio, and Le Petit Prince is even smaller. And I think on that sort of level, I kind of, even in a 2026 mindset, Phil, I don't think broad audiences would be attractive enough to someone that small. And I think that kind of stinks, but I think that's also like just kind of populism to a degree, you know, of like, that's just kind of how it is. That's how our brains work.
Yeah, the sync is very strong today, because I was going to talk about that too, but in a moment when we talk about
my job as the host is to tee everything up for you. So I'm glad I'm nailing it.
Yeah. Before we move on to historical significance, though, I do want to say one final thing about influence, is that, and it's something that you again alluded to earlier, is that growing influence, as more and more people are kind of checking out the footage, perhaps you will become a little bit more influential. Obviously, not to a large degree or anything.
No.
But here, actually, I'll shout out Rob Viper. If you don't follow him on Twitter, follow him, because in the past, he's mentioned to me that he's been talking to some younger wrestlers and they've been actually watching the Petit Prince footage and studying him,
Oh, really?
which to me is pretty cool. I mean, I don't know of many wrestlers that watch footage from the 60s. And I mean, if I was a wrestler, I would be doing it. I can
Yeah.
tell you that. But I don't know of many there are. So hearing that, I thought that was very cool. And I hope it continues to happen more and more.
I agree, because I do think, as we sort of talked about it, as I raved in his in-ring work section, it is something that I think like it is so there's so much to grasp from his in-ring style. Like I said, like, and I think it is that sort of evolution of the highly acrobatic, high flying style of like, especially in American sense, a lot of detractors saying you want more grounded stuff or you want a built-in realism. That's what I really like about Petit Prince, is that it's always like built-in realism, that he's doing these, he's using it as a tool to get to a wrestling move. And I think that in a lot of ways, I think that is kind of what an American modern style sort of can go down to, is how do we use this move set to get to a wrestling maneuver or something like that.
Yeah.
But I digress. Historical significance. What is there to say there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to me, there's not a lot there, but that said, there is some significance in a sense that how many lightweights, actually strike lightweights, how many flyweights in history were ever booked as and presented as special attractions?
Yeah.
I mean, not many. I mean, someone might come and be cheeky here and say, oh, well, they were midget wrestlers. Yeah, sure. But those were like a comedic attraction. He was actually viewed as and was treated as a serious wrestler. So
Yeah.
it's not the same thing at all. But yeah, I mean, how many? And like you were mentioning, forget the past. Today, how many flyweights in a major promotion today are a featured act? Obviously, not a main event act, but a featured act nonetheless. I mean, obviously, there's Yoshirai. That's
Yeah,
but I mean,
well,
on the men's side,
especially on a male wrestling scale, because obviously a female
exactly.
wrestling scale, there's smaller bodies
Yeah,
to
of course.
deal with here.
I mean, I can't think of
Yeah.
anyone really. Maybe I'm forgetting someone, but to me, that's kind of unique and significant. But the downside to it is obviously it's on a smaller scale. That scale being France, and that really works against them ultimately.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and that's the thing, is like and that's how I sort of feel generally when we sort of talk and sort of move into this looking at the rest of the world region as a whole. That is sort of the sort of toss up I have here when it comes to Le Petit Prince. It is this thing of this there is so much upside and so much strength when it comes to his in-ring working ability, that I see so much praise for it. But on the other hand, it's like I look at like the rest of it and I'm like, it is a desolate desolate thing of like, there's like scraps of stuff where you're like, okay, there's something here, you know, I guess I'd kind of maybe cobble together something, but it's like there is really nothing, which not nothing. There really isn't a lot to really,
Yeah.
you know, bite into. And I think that is sort of the frustration I have when I'm looking at the region as a whole, because the region as a whole, as we sort of, did I talk about it on air? I don't remember. Look, talking about the region as a whole, I think the rest of the world region is an extremely tough region coming up this fall. It's an extremely tough region, I think. There are a lot of people that are near the top there. There are three guys that are about, you know, at the 1550, I believe, in the fall. So there's going to be a lot of focus on the top half, and this is a new guy coming in. How is he going to do? I do not know, because it is difficult. There is a research issue where, as we sort of talk about with Jay Bear, there's a decent amount with newspapers and whatnot. With Petit Prince, there's the issue of like newspapers and that very slow drip of more information. Because if I recall correctly, the newspaper issue, it's a 40-year situation.
I wish you were 70.
Oh God,
Yeah.
70 years.
So 2 weeks ago we got the newspapers for 1956. Sorry, 1955.
So to that point, then we literally have to wait a decade to get his TV debut for Bronze.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's sort of where I'm at. And that's also kind of like, I'm kind of not shocked, but like a little bit surprised of Bronze coming up at this point, because it is like we are going to get, I think the meatier part of the conversation for Bronze will be, sadly, in a decade, where we can really start thinking about it. But look, ideally, this Hall of Fame exists that length of time. Should I pull up the full region here to sort of discuss? Get any thoughts? What you have? Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, maybe to wrap up the Prince conversation, I would say, I mean, like Dave always says, obviously, when he sends out the ballot, that there's, of course, three categories, and ideally, each candidate should be strong in all three, or so outstanding in one that this overrides the other two. So now the question comes down to, does a voter feel so strongly about Prince as a worker that they're willing to overlook his weaknesses in the other categories? So that's really the first important question. But also, and this is something that you alluded to earlier, it's a very tough category. It's a very tough ballot this year. So even if someone feels very strongly about Prince as a worker, you have to also justify voting, making him one of your four picks in a very competitive field. So that's the other big issue that he's facing.
All right. So I have in front of you now, Phil. I'm sure you also have it on a separate tab. I have in front of you now the rest of the world ballot. This is obviously what it looks like right now. Dave could probably add someone. I doubt he will. I don't think he ever does in the rest of the world, really, especially in a modern sense. I don't think we're adding anyone here. Oh, I guess we could. There's always a chance. Right now, as of it speaks, we have 14 acts, which means you have 4 votes the next season. At the top of the pack, you have Jose Torres. Then you have Otto Vans, Billy Joyce, George Gordienko, Dominic DeNucci, Adrian Street, the Royal Brothers, Ted Boy Marino, Gilbert Leduc, Killer Carl Cox, Steve Gray. Here we go. Tibor Zakas. That's my guess. Andreas Lambrakis and La Petite Prince.
Yep.
Phil, where are you sitting right now? Where are you feeling? What are you thinking about the rest of the world?
Well, first, let me say that I like what's happened with the ballot this year in the sense that it's more international than it's ever been before.
Agreed.
So that I think this is very cool because it encourages people to look up more people. And quick shout out, I gotta give him some credit for this. I believe Ethan Tyler had a lot to do with it. I think he was the one who kind of suggested a lot of these names to Dave to kind of expand the section and make it, quite frankly, more interesting and more competitive. Now, in terms of my thoughts, I want to give quick thoughts on 3 guys in particular because they're the 3 that I've researched the most here, apart from Gilbert, who we talked about last year. I won't be discussing him now. But those 3 guys, I think I can add some extra value, so to speak, and maybe give some perspective that perhaps people don't have. So the first guy I want to quickly mention is Jose Torres, who now I know quite a bit about him, but my knowledge of him was based on my general research on Spain, France, etc. I had never really specifically focused my research on him until last year. Last year, I specifically focused on him, and let me tell you, I was strong on him, but actually after doing the research on him, I'm super strong on him now. and the reason, and I'll just, there's a number of reasons, but I'll just say one reason that maybe puts him in perspective. Let's do it like this. Let's break it down like this. He debuts February 1947, first professional wrestling match on the secondary shows in Barcelona, which at the time was obviously it still is the second biggest city in Spain, and at the time it was one of the biggest promotions in Spain. So by week 3, he's headlining the B shows. By month 3, then they send him over to Valencia, where he starts headlining shows at a 17,000 seat bull ring. 3 months into his career. A week later, they also send him to Alicante, which is a 15,000 seat bull ring, and he starts headlining there along with Valencia all summer long, like 3 months into his career. Now, I don't necessarily have exact attendance numbers for a lot of those early shows, but I'll tell you, there sure are a lot of reports in the press of good attendance, great crowd, back to capacity. So that tells me whether it was 5, 10, 20, I don't know how many thousand people, but by all accounts, he was drawing quite well. And this was 3-4 months into his career, which if you look at the history of wrestling, the number of guys to start drawing, potentially 10,000 and above within 3 months, that's a far few in between. I mean, it's very little. I mean, I can think of Gus Sonnenberg, Dano Mahoney, and not much else at the moment. but yeah, that's an important point to make. And I think it really kind of puts into perspective his career, because remember, this was just the first few months, and then he went on to wrestle for another 20 years. And I have a record of him headlining over 200 shows in Spain at such big venues. So potentially we're looking at a lot of big crowds there. And I'm not even covering the shows where he was in the semi-main event position, and also obviously part of the draw. But that's the first thing I'll say in terms of Tavares. The second guy I want to touch upon is right below him, which is Otto Wanz, which, to be honest, I'm surprised that he's that high, but I'm also kind of glad, because hopefully this means that maybe more people will start paying attention to him, because I think, despite what the vote might suggest, I think he's kind of an overlooked name in a research sense, because I never really see much discussion about him beyond the surface level. And I also think there are a few misconceptions about him that stem from people just not being super familiar with his career and just German and Austrian wrestling in general. So I just quickly want to throw out a couple of quick things and just to point it out to people, because it irks me when I see it getting butchered online. So the first thing I want to say is this. People always, and I say people, I'm generalizing, of course. Some people know their stuff, but in general, people tend to kind of put all of German and Austrian wrestling under the CWA banner. They tend to think it was CWA and nothing else. That is absolutely wrong. For the number one reason being is that CWA as a company, the company between Otto Wanz and Peter William, did not exist until 1986. So anybody talking about CWA before 1986 is completely wrong. That's the first thing to point out, because you see it, people get it wrong all the time. Second thing is the notion that Otto Wanz, he was only a star because he was the promoter, so he put himself on top, kept himself on top. That's why he was the champion and the star. That is true, but to a certain extent, and to a much smaller extent than most people realize. What I mean by that is that, again, up to 1986, when CWA was formed, Otto Wanz was a promoter in one town and one town only. That being his hometown, where he would promote a show, a tournament, I should say, once a year. That's it. So for anybody saying that, oh, he put himself on top, yeah, after 86, sure, that's a completely valid argument. Hold it against him, absolutely. But before 86, it was other promoters seeing money in Otto Wanz and putting him on top because he drew good business for them. That's it. And I think that's an important point to make, because people often get it wrong. And the final thing I'll say about him, although I almost don't want to say it because it's going to get me a bunch of heat, especially with my UK guys. Sorry, UK guys. There is this, let me backtrack a little bit. I think sometimes also what happens with Otto is sometimes people dismiss him a little bit too much as a worker, in a sense that they see this, chubby, older European guy, and they go, oh, he's just another big daddy, another big daddy. Well, let me give you this quote, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's a quote that I read, I believe, on Pro Wrestling Only, and it stuck with me, and I think it's a very appropriate quote to get my point across. The quote was this, and this was right in the middle of all the Big Daddy discussion. The quote goes like this: if Big Daddy was half as good as Otto Wanz, he'd be in the Hall of Fame. So again, I'm not saying I agree, but to an extent I do, because my whole point here is this. Listen, I'm not saying Otto Wanz was some super worker, Hall of Fame level. I'm not saying anything of the sort. What I'll say, though, is that for what he was, if you actually go back and watch his matches, he was pretty decent at what he needed to be, which is a super heavyweight powerhouse, minimalistic, mixed in with some local hero, Jerry Lawler type of stuff. So he kind of would sell, he would fire up, he would work the crowd, he would work these 20, 30 matches. So please don't paint him in the same light as Big Daddy. He was a different type of worker, and he would actually have some, decent matches. Obviously, if you're expecting technical wrestling, if you're expecting high flying, you're not going to get that from him. But if you look at him for what he was and what he was trying to do, he was pretty all right at what he was. So I just want to throw it out there. And again, I apologize for my UK folks. I know I'll get heat, but I had to say it.
I just want to point out here, Otto Wanz, last year, 24.9%. This year, was 2025 rather, he had 41.3. So he was one of the bigger jumps of the year. So that's pretty impressive. The other thing I also want to say before you talk about the third person that you're really speaking of. And I assume you're when you're talking about these people, you're also thinking about voting them, Jose Torres and Otto Vons, for next fall. I mean, it's hard to say it in January, but you know what I mean. You're considering them at this point.
Yeah, Torres for sure. Otto, he's a
It's
border.
the
I
other
don't know.
thing I want to point out here is that there are three. I said that before. There are three people. On the 1550, those are Billy Joyce, Dominic DiNucci, and Killer Carl Cox are all on the 1550 for next year. So that's another thing to point out here. Who is the third person, Phil, that you are strongly research? I guess researching or thinking about is maybe a better
Mhm.
word.
Yeah, the third person is Mabel. No, I'm just joking. No, no. So the third person is Andreas Lambrakis, actually. All jokes aside,
Oh, perfect.
and
Great. I love to hear that.
yeah.
Eventually, obviously, the goal is to do an episode about him. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'll be your guy there, but I'll tell you right now, I'm not doing a podcast.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, the reason why is because I've said most what I've have to say already about him, and actually I'm about to plug something. If you go to Google and you type in the career of Andreas Lambrakis, you will see an article by me. Now,
Mhm.
keep in mind, it's from 7 years ago. It's kind of outdated. I need to update it a bit, which I will eventually before the ballot. But it kind of summarizes the career of Andreas Lambrakis and gives you an idea of who he was. And who he was really was after Jim Londo's perhaps the second biggest star in the history of Greece, which at one point was a pretty big territory in Europe, particularly in the summer, actually just in the summer, I would say. And unlike Londos, who did less than 10 matches in Greece, Lambrakis was there for years. So it's a different thing altogether. So he was a guy who helped pioneer the Greek pro wrestling scene in the 1930s. Then in the 1940s, mid of 1940s onward, he was one of the first guys to start drawing big crowds in Greece outside of Londos. When I say big crowds, I mean 10,000 and above.
Mm-hmm.
Then in the 50s, when they started bringing in international talent, he was one of the guys who was wrestling those international talent, and again, drawing big crowds that way, as opposed to Greek opponents as before. And then in the early 1960s, he was the top star of Greek pro wrestling, and that's when Greek pro wrestling entered its absolute peak. I mean, it started with him, then he kind of retired. It went on without him, but he was kind of the guy who ushered in that era. So that's important to make. And the reason why he's on this ballot really is because he's much like a Jose Torres in a sense that in his home country, he was a big star and a big draw. Now, obviously, we don't have the full numbers. We're never going to have the full numbers. But based on what I've been able to find, I can tell you that in Greece, I have a record of, and I'm looking at my notes here, 22 crowds that Lambrakis drew as a main event star of 7,000 and above. Of those 22, 15 were of 10,000 or above. And of those 15, 4 were 15,000 or above. So he's got some numbers to him that not everyone in that section has. I mean, a lot of it due to lack of information, but either way, he's got that going for him. And the final thing I will say about the drawing thing, though, and it's a bit of a funny thing, but it's also there's a point to it. See, in the 64, 65 in Greece, they were on a bit of a Titanes in the ring kick. So they started doing these goofy gimmicks like a blind robot who would be led to the ring by a handler because, he was blind. And the goofy gimmick, of course, yeah. And the goofy gimmick, although he wasn't presented as goofy, but if you look at a photo of him, he was absolutely goofy looking. They did a masked hunchback. Now, when I say a hunchback, don't think it wasn't a guy who was really hunchback. It was a guy wearing a wrestling attire and with a fake hunchback behind his shirt. So it looks every bit as ridiculous as you would imagine. But here's the
I
key
think
part.
I've heard of this. Hold on, I think I've heard of this gimmick.
Yeah, well, Jim Hurt would have loved it too. But anyway, so the important thing is that hunchback guy did a 3-match series with Lambrakis, and he was actually presented as a serious threat. He beat him up in a few minutes, made him bloody, etc. And then in the third match, they wrestled, ended without the winner. But the point is, and I don't know if this number is true, but this was the reported number in the press: 15,000 people for Andreas Lambrakis versus the goofy mask hunchback. And in my book, if you can draw 15,000 people against the goofy mask hunchback,
Yeah.
I mean, you're a Hall of Famer. I'll just say that. I mean, I'm halfway joking, but at the same time, I'm not. So that's kind of wild. So
That is insane. That is
yeah,
insane. Uh,
Yeah.
if I recall, I want to say that the gimmick was that because of the hunchback, he was difficult to pin. I
Yep.
think is what the gimmick was.
Yep.
wh-
Yep.
Which is like it is like a perfect kind of wrestling joke to make,
Yeah.
but then to get paying 15,000 people to pay for it is in that's 15 that's insane. That's
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah.
Um, I
But
like
but
it.
let me wrap up the Lambrakis discussion, and we can kind of close up.
Yeah,
So but the downside to Lambrakis is, okay, he was a draw in Greece. Now he also wrestled quite a bit internationally. He was all over Europe, Australia, South America, all over North America. But really, in most places, he wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, some places he headlined, like in Australia, but more or less he was a mid card opening match. So the bulk of his career, when you take out Greece out of it, it's not that impressive.
yeah,
So that's one thing. The other thing is it's difficult to judge him as a worker because he finished his career in 65 and there's only one match available. It's from 1960 when he was at the end of his career, and it's against Gorgeous George of all people.
yeah.
So it's
And
not much of a
I
match.
watched the match. It is a gorgeous George match. It is not a
Yeah,
Lembrakis is just a guy in it. It is
yeah,
nothing about him whatsoever.
exactly. So in far as working, it's not possible to judge him really. And the final point I wanted to make about him, which is escaping my mind, so I guess I'll close it up here.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, if it comes back in, don't worry about it. So
Yeah.
those are the people you're thinking about. Just to tie it back to the rest of the world, was there, I'm not going to commit you to anyone right now, be like who you're thinking about.
Mm,
But is there sort of like anyone in there? Or how do you feel? Or is there anyone in there that you're really thinking about? I assume Jose, is
mm,
you're certainly thinking about. Is there anyone else you're really like drawn to in terms of at this moment, or maybe people that you voted in the past?
mhm.
Maybe if not, how do you feel about sort of Jabert and Prince on this ballot? What are your sort of thoughts on the region? If there's anyone that you're completely drawn to in here
Mhm.
outside of
Yeah,
those three?
yeah. Before that, I remembered my final point about Lambrakis. He was also the mentor of Spiros Arion. That's the other point I wanted to make
Yeah, yeah.
early on.
I think at one point I forget was it Spiros had his name or he had Spiros's name or something. There
Yeah,
was like a
Arion Lambrakis. Yeah, he
yeah.
went by Arion Lambrakis.
There
Spiros
was
did.
like because I remember in my research for I've done a little bit of research on Andreas Lambrakis where when Lambrakis died, people
Mhm.
thought it was Spiros Arion that died because they
Yeah,
had the same name or something similar name at some point in their careers.
yeah, because Spiros worked as his son basically,
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
the names got mixed up and anything else. Yeah. But as far as thoughts, I mean, those three guys that I mentioned, yes, Taurus, I'm definitely leaning in favor of. The other two, I just kind of wanted to throw out some
No,
information.
I appreciate it.
It's not that I'm necessarily heavily leaning in their favor, but I am definitely considering them though. And if I'm being honest, I mean, about half of the guys on this ballot I would consider.
Yeah.
I don't know who. I mean, last year, to be honest, I had a tough time picking four. It was tough.
Who am I don't know if you reveal it typically. Who did you do you know if you're okay with saying it? Do you know who did you vote for last year?
Mhm. Yeah, I believe I voted for Tavares, Leduc, Gordienko, and Arion, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Okay. So the people you have coming back are Leduc, Torres, and Gordienko.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah,
Okay.
but I was kind of on the fence a little bit. But yeah, it was a tough. Like I was like very strongly leaning towards Marino as well, but
Mhm.
ultimately went with my boy Leduc. So
We got to represent.
yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. How do you feel like last little bit here is talking about the region. How do you feel like how do you feel about Leduc getting 23.4% as sort of a starting position?
I was pleasantly surprised, to be honest. I expected him to do worse. So
Sure.
good on him. Good on him. And that's why I'm also very interested to see what Prince would do. Because I think if you compare the two, I think on paper, Leduc is the stronger one overall,
Mhm.
but Prince is more visible, meaning
Sure.
more people have awareness of him, I would think. So it should be really interesting to see how they work out in terms of votes, how they compare.
Agreed. Agreed. And like I said, you also have those three people on the 1550 that are probably going to eat up a good amount of votes of people being like, hey, this might be my last chance to vote for Killer Carl Cox. I doubt it. I fully suspect him falling off. All right. Well, I have one last little question here that I've started doing for this season, which is the sort of conversation of what do you sort of think needs to maybe happen or maybe change or help Prince's case. Obviously, we laid it out, but there's obviously holes to a degree when it comes to people's cases every once in a while. We sort of laid out a little bit, but is there any sort of things that could maybe change in sort of the voting body or change in terms of research or something like that you think could maybe like what has to happen to sort of help get Prince into the Hall of Fame in your eyes?
For Prince, I don't know that there's anything that can change necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, other than time, meaning more people becoming aware. Because he's not. I don't think he's one of those guys to where if you research his career more, you'll become more convinced of his, credentials. I think it really comes down to how strongly do you feel about him as a worker, and can you justify voting for him compared to the other candidates. So for him, not much that can be done other than what's already there.
No, and I fully agree. And again, the time of, it's going to take a decade before we start seeing some newspapers about him too. So there is actual time that has to happen to maybe even get more research when it comes to Prince. And I agree. Unless we get something that's like, I would love if like 10, 15, 20 years, we start getting those newspapers and it's like it is like an unearthing of like, opening like the Pulp Fiction briefcase and like the shining light of like a Hall of Fame case comes out of those newspapers. I don't necessarily suspect it, but I would love something like that. You know what I mean? But we'll always see what happens. Phil, it is always a pleasure talking to you. It is always a pleasure. I love talking to you on these episodes. I love talking to you coming on the ballot. It's been a pleasure so much for coming on. Is there, in the classic podcast format, is there any sort of plugs or anything that you want to drive people towards that maybe you're working on, or anything that you want people to sort of check out?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. I had a great time, same as last time. Really enjoyed it. Great conversation. As far as plugs, I mean, not really. I'm not all that active. I mean, I do post a little bit on Twitter, but maybe follow me there if you want to. But if you don't, that's okay. It doesn't matter anyway. To be honest, I don't care about followers too much.
Real quickly, I should say a couple weeks ago, by the time this episode comes out, you're probably still going to do it. But there is, you because of his sort of anniversary, you were posting a lot of Prince content, I imagine, in preparation of this as well. So go check out, obviously, Phil's Twitter just to see, do a search. I don't know how to do it perfectly. Do a search, Phil's Twitter, look up Le Petit Prince, and you can be able to see a lot of stuff, little tidbits about Prince.
Yeah. I mean, if you're interested in history, check me out. If not, it's fine. I'm not the type that cares whether it's 10 followers, 1,000 followers. Doesn't matter to me. As long as you enjoy the content, that's what matters.
Exactly right. Well, Phil, as always, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this month's episode of The Ballot. If you have any questions, comments, or revelations you have about Le Petit Prince, about our conversation, you can obviously give us a email. Send us an email at countoutnetwork@gmail.com. I completely blanked. Or you can leave us a voicemail at our voicemail box at 9495-BALLOT. That's going to be 949-522-5568. Again, 9495-BALLOT. And you can leave us a little voicemail if you have any thoughts or opinions, or maybe even questions. I thought about that. If you have any questions, I can always send them over to Phil and be like, hey, Phil, give us some answers or anything about this. And I'm sure he will begrudgingly answer me. But again, Phil, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We'll check you all next month for another wrestler, potentially two wrestlers. That's not a teaser about a tag team. Well, it could be. I don't know. But potentially a couple of wrestlers next month for an all new episode of The Ballot. Until then, have a good one, everybody. The Ballot podcast was recorded and produced by myself, Ryan Knightsey, as part of the Count Out Wrestling Podcast Network. Please rate, subscribe, and most importantly, review the show wherever podcasts are found. If you would like to leave a comment, question, or reaction to an episode, please drop us a line at 9495-BALLOT or 949-522-5568. Otherwise, you can contact us at countoutnetwork@gmail.com. Have a good day, and we'll talk to you next time on The Ballot. This has been a Count Out Podcast.